and Senator Rand Paul. They have forcefully presented their point of view in the book, The Case Against Socialism. Our role as the leading proprietor of, one of the leading proprietors of books, is to always be open to a full range of viewpoints. And Kelly is a personal friend of mine, and Rand does privacy and civil liberties work with my husband, Senator Ron Wyden, who represents Oregon. And with that, let's get on to having a spirited discussion that's part of the Strand tradition. Welcome Kelly Paul and Senator Rand Paul to the Strand.
Thanks everybody for coming out, and thanks to Nancy for hosting us. And as she mentioned, her husband Ron is a senator from Oregon, and you wouldn't believe this if you watch the news, but we actually are friends. We get along. It's not like The View. We don't yell at each other. And the interesting thing is I think it's one of the things that's really misreported about politics in our country, is that there's so much anger in there, and all of it's really apparently Donald Trump's fault. You know, there's so much anger, and it's like, well, who influenced those women on The View to be so angry? I mean, it's like, but here's the thing, in Washington, we don't really yell and scream at each other. You see it on the cable news shows, you see it online, the internet, but as Nancy mentioned, Ron and I work together on privacy issues, Fourth Amendment issues, and we probably have a dozen bills that we co-sponsor together. Does it mean we agree on everything? No. But what happens in Washington is people from the other side of the aisle, you acknowledge the things you agree with them on, and you work together with those, and then the things you don't, really you kind of leave out, because I'm probably not convincing him of anything, and he's probably not convincing me of anything that we have long held beliefs on. But on privacy, we just happen to be exactly on the same side. I would say with the Democrats on issues of war, we have a lot of things in common. Even Bernie Sanders, who we go after in this book, he and I, at least before this book came out, we're on good terms. Now we'll see after the book is out for a while whether we're still on good terms, but I can give you a couple of examples of things that I've worked with him on. One would be in the defense bill that's been put forward recently, we have language that says that we should not go to war in Iran unless Congress votes on it. It's like, well, duh. I mean, that's like a restatement of the Constitution, and yet I can't believe anybody would vote against that, but it ends up being there are very few Republicans that will vote for that. Mike Lee and I will vote for that, and actually more Democrats will vote for that, and I work with Bernie on that. I worked with Bernie on trying to end the war in Yemen. I don't really want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia because I think the war is a disaster and there's no good coming of that, the war in Yemen. But back to the book. The book. We kind of got the idea to write the book. Kelly and I have been talking about this and looking at the numbers that are coming out about the young generation, and the young generation being sort of enthralled with this idea that socialism would be a good thing. And we thought, well, gosh, if you know the history of the 20th century, it's hard to find any example of socialism that's not associated with genocide and famine, and or both. And so it's hard to imagine how anybody could be for it. So in the book, we talk a little bit about that, but we also talk a lot about Scandinavia in the sense that they keep saying, well, we're not for that kind of socialism. Although in our country, there were American intellectuals who were for Stalin for 20 or 30 years. New York Times, Walter Duranty traveled over there, wrote about it, got a Pulitzer Prize, and really in the end, the New York Times eventually apologized for his reporting on the Soviet Union because it wasn't accurate. We finally, some people knew, but really the entire world knew when Khrushchev ultimately admitted what Stalin had done and that millions of people had died. But today socialists will say, well, that's not the kind of socialism you want, you know, we're not for authoritarianism. And this is a little bit of the debate I was having with the so-called Republican Ana Navarro yesterday, is that she's like, oh, Maduro's a thug, he's a murderer. And I'm like, well, yeah, but he's also a socialist. And maybe there's a connection between socialism and thuggery. But she wouldn't let me get a word out because she was like, no, he's just a murderer and a thug. And it's like, well, can't you be both? And maybe there's a linkage between centralizing power, where just a small group of people have the power, that maybe corruption and kleptocracy is more common when you only have a few people running your country instead of having what we like to call democratic capitalism. Because really the ultimate democracy is with your money. You either shop at Walmart, you shop at Target, you shop at Kmart, you shop at the Strand, I hope. The thing is, but people make those decisions, and the power is more diffuse, and if there are corrupt people, hopefully the law or whatever catches them. But if one person runs everything, it's much more likely if that person becomes corrupt that it affects your entire society. I taught a course at George Mason about a year ago, and that sort of was the beginnings of thinking about the book. And the course that I taught was called The Dystopian Novel. So everybody's heard of 1984, everybody's heard of Brave New World, but what we looked at was sort of the lineage and the connection that 1984 is probably the most famous, but coming before that is Brave New World. Coming also before 1984 is Ayn Rand's Anthem. But really coming before any of these dystopian novels was a novel by Zamyatin called We. And a lot of people, I see heads nodding, have read it, but if you haven't read it, it's very much worth reading. But then I don't think a lot of people have taught the course, there are different dystopian novel courses, then taught it with a linkage back one step further removed. And really I think, and maybe this is my own bias, but mine one step further removed from Zamyatin is once again another Russian writer, Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky writes the Notes from Underground, and in it he doesn't really make a pragmatic argument against socialism. In fact, the word may not have been around then. They were either called nihilist, but there was this idea that we'd base society on reason and rationality, and it would be known what was in the best interest of people, and people would like it. Government would be rational, and it would be humane, and it would be all-encompassing, but it would be sort of this idea of trying to achieve perfection. Well, the Underground Man responds to that, and responds to the symbol of the Crystal Palace, which was built in England about in the 1840s or 1850s. And he says, well, maybe you might just want to stick your tongue out at it. You may want to act irrational. You may want to bump into somebody. You may think that part of being alive is expressing your free will, and it may not always be rational. In fact, maybe irrationality is a part of showing that you're alive. Another thing that Dostoevsky talks about in it is the idea of, if we talk about a perfectible society where government's going to be the perfect instrument of a perfectible society, we talk about something that maybe the perfect ends are not exactly what we want. Maybe part of being alive is actually the act of attaining. And I was at Columbia the other day, I was talking about the idea that getting your degree is important, but maybe going to college is about going to college. Maybe fighting a legal battle or doing something in your career isn't always about the end result. It's about the striving. It's about the attaining. It's about the whole process of life, and it isn't about the results. But as I taught this course, I became more and more interested in looking at socialism in general. And one of the interesting things about Notes from Underground is it actually is a response to a novel called What Is to Be Done by a guy named Chernyshevsky. And Chernyshevsky, and this book, this was actually Lenin's favorite book, and it's been described as the least famous but most influential book out there. Nobody's ever heard of it, and I wouldn't bother reading it. It's a terrible read, actually. But it's really only famous and only well known now because Notes from Underground was written as a response to it. And Chernyshevsky, building on Plato and building on all of these people who believed in the perfectibility of man, sort of presents this new man, which later became the new Soviet man, because what happened is they began talking about perfectibility, and they're talking about having these sort of selfless philosopher kings that would be disinterested, and you get this perfectible society, is that as they did, they discovered, guess what? Man's nature may not be disinterested. Man's nature actually may be selfish. And so they said, well, I guess we're going to have to change man's nature. And I guess when you start talking about changing man's nature and molding man's nature, to me that sounds like it may include some violence or some force in order to do that. But the other side says that's not what they're for. And they weren't for Stalin, they weren't for Hitler, they weren't for Mao. They were initially kind of for Castro. In fact, Bernie, was very complimentary of Castro for a long time, not so much anymore. But each time it was sort of discovered that the socialism trended towards authoritarianism, then the socialists in our country and the intellectuals would back away from it. Same with Venezuela. Chavez was lauded by everybody. Oliver Stone does 2 biopics to how great Chavez was. Noah Chomsky loved Chavez, Michael Moore, Sean Penn, they all loved Chavez until they didn't. Or actually, we say they loved Chavez and Maduro until people lost 20 pounds and began eating their pets in Venezuela, and then socialism didn't look so good. But this has happened time and time again, and so one of the themes of the book is violence inherent to socialism? Or is it just an accident? So that's what the socialists want you to believe. They want you to believe Hitler was an accident, well then Stalin was an accident, and then Mao accidentally came to power and killed 50 million people or whatever. And one after another, they think it's sort of an accident of history. Hayek and others, though, have looked at this, and they say that basically it may be that when you want complete socialism, when you want the government to own the means of production, when you want the government to own the land, when you want things to be owned collectively, it may well be that you can't have a kinder, gentler dictator. What you really need, if you're going to be efficient, if you want the best socialist leader, then you have to select for ruthlessness. So maybe ruthlessness is not an accident, but if you really want to take people's property, there's a point at which they will resist, and you're going to need to use violence. You need someone who is unafraid to use violence, and so maybe evolutionarily the selection process for leaders in socialism, as you centralize power and as you're going to take the land and take the property and redistribute it, it has to end up being something that is a ruthless leader. One of the, I think, ironic things about socialism is some people come from the left and they say, and like really everyone does now, that you want the law to be equally applied. We want equal protection of the law regardless of who you are. And yet, if you want complete socialism where we have equality of outcome, the only way to have equality of outcome, since we're unequal, we have different talents, some of us work harder, some of us have a great idea, some of us have some product that everybody wants and becomes richer, but the only way we can make ourselves equal, if the government's going to do it, is we have to treat people unequally. So the irony is, those people who are advocating equal protection, that the law treat everybody the same, if you want people to be the same in the end, you know, I could give you all $1,000 and you walk out the door and 10 minutes later somebody's got $1,500 and somebody's got $500 because you swapped something. We're unequal, and the distribution of our talents is unequal. But if you want to make everybody equal, you're going to have to treat people unequally by the law, and I think that's a great irony of the concept of socialism. But the thing is throughout time they say over and over again, that's not what we want. That's not what we want. Well, we did want Castro, but we don't want him anymore. We did want Chavez, but we don't want him anymore. But they keep saying, we want a kinder, gentler form of socialism, and they all point to Scandinavia. And this is part of the book that Kelly did a lot of work on, is talking about Scandinavian socialism or the lack thereof.
Yes, that's right. One of the things, interesting things in doing research on the book, interviewing, and reading a lot about what they do, is that we found out that in Scandinavia, they don't actually do most of the things that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are advocating for. If you listen to them and talking about democratic socialism and how we could achieve that in the United States, I'm sure you've heard the terms, you know, Medicare for all, free college education. So they stress those things, and that they are going to do this in America with taxing the rich, making the rich pay their fair share. But one of the messages that we go through in the book, and we go in exhaustive detail of what they do, is that they don't have punitive taxes on the rich there. The dirty little secret there is, first of all, they are not socialists. They are purely capitalistic countries. Stock market, private property, extremely low corporate taxes, much lower than the United States had until they were lowered in the Trump tax cuts. So we actually lowered ours during the Trump tax cuts to be more equal to theirs, because they've had low corporate taxes really since the 90s. They got rid of their wealth taxes in 2007. They have no minimum wage. You know, we look at, and you can argue this, Rand was trying to bring this up at the View, with what we pay in the United States, our income taxes are actually more progressive than theirs. It's kind of a math problem. In the US, our top 1% pays nearly 40% of the income tax. In Sweden, for example, their top no, actually, let's do a 10%. Our top 10% pays 70% of the income tax in the U.S., whereas in Sweden, the top 10% pays about a quarter, about 25% of their total income tax, which is not the message that you're getting from those that are advocating that we could pay for something like, nationalized health care and free education. What they do is every single Scandinavian country has an extremely high value-added tax, a VAT. It's 25% on everything you buy. A pair of jeans, a dozen eggs. I mean, this includes food and beverage. So anyone who's ever traveled to Denmark or Sweden will tell you it's insanely expensive because right off the top, and that 25% is applied throughout the entire production chain of everything. So it's 25%. The government is getting that huge swath. Now, as we all know, of course, the less money you have, the poorer you are, your consumption takes up a much larger percentage of your income. So that ends up being an extremely regressive tax on the poor in those countries. The other thing is their tax rates hit very high, a huge swath of the middle class. So for example, in Denmark, if you're making about $65,000 a year, $65,000 a year, you're being taxed at 60%. Boom, right there. That's where it starts for them, and then it just stays there all the way up. So it's a very hard-hitting middle-class tax burden and lower-class tax burden. I always laugh because when people try to compare us to the Danes, which obviously our countries are extremely different. It's a very small, very homogenous country, very similar culturally, but the pictures you always see are the Danes riding those bicycles, and they're so healthy looking, and they're fitter than we are, they're thinner, they've got ruddy cheeks. That's because they had, until last year, a 200% tax on automobiles. 200%. People, I don't even believe it. Last year they did have somewhat of an uprising and elect quite a few libertarians who had argued that tax down. So it's been lowered in the last year to 100%. But as my friend who I interviewed quite a bit in the book, she's a Danish journalist, she said, look, buying a car is something that most young people just do not do in our country. It's not something that is affordable for anyone until they're much older. It's by transportation. And again, so every time I hear Bernie or Elizabeth Warren talking about this, I just want them to be honest about what they're talking about. If you really want, it is a trade-off. Yes, they do have completely nationalized health service, and they do have free college education. Again, back to the education though, as I mentioned at Columbia, when the state is paying for it, they take a much greater interest in what you're studying and who gets to go. It is actually much more stringent in terms of requirements. For example, if you want to study political science, which is a very popular major, we were at Columbia, we're talking to a lot of these kids in the Libertarian Club and the Free Speech Club, and a lot of more poli-sci majors. Poli-sci in Denmark, since they don't actually need a lot of political scientists, you want to study that, you will have to be in the top 10%. I mean, equivalent to how hard it is like to get into medical school to study a lot of these subjects. So again, so if you're not in the top 10%, you will have to choose a major that is in more demand by the state. So, hey, we need more computer sciences. Well, I'm bad at math. Well, you may be looking at a trade, which again, a lot of people do choose that. So it's interesting that even though their college is free, in quite a few of the Scandinavian countries, their amount of students that are actually going to college is really very similar to the U.S. because they, either can't get into the major they want, or they're choosing more of a trade. So those are some of the things. I think that the conversation has been so much on the left right now in terms of income inequality. I mean, we're at a point right now in our country where we do have now our median income is up to $65,000 a year. It's gone up $4,000 just since Donald Trump has been elected, and people don't really want to talk about that. They want to talk about the difference between the richest in our country and the poorest. But as we have seen, there is pretty wide income inequality in the United States, and a widening part of that in terms of money income. there's actually a shrinking of inequality in terms of consumption. With trade, cheaper goods, we actually see World Bank consumption figures showed that the bottom 20% of income earners in the United States actually consume more goods and services than the median or middle income earners in affluent countries in Europe and Scandinavia. So I think sometimes the more moral question is not does everyone have the same, but does everyone have enough? So that's one of the arguments we make in the book. And again, we're just trying to put it out there that if you believe that a national health service is a great idea, then be honest about how it is actually being paid for. And in those countries, it is absolutely being paid. I think most people would say if you're making $60,000, you're middle class. In those countries, you are being taxed at 60%, and you're paying a 25% VAT on every single thing that you buy. So it is much more expensive. And again, the car is at 100%.
So in the book, we tell the story, or retell the story about Boris and Igor, and you know, the fairy godmother comes down and says to Boris and Igor, "You can have anything you want." And so Boris looks at Igor, who has one scrawny little goat, and he says, "Well, I wish Igor's goat would die." That's what income inequality is about. Why didn't he wish for 20 goats for himself, or 1,000 goats, or he wished that his neighbor's goat would die? It's sort of, income inequality is about envy, and really it's ridiculous when you think about it. Most people look at it and say it's not even something that even is measurable or of any value to measure it for your country. So for example, which country would you rather live in where the average poor person makes $30,000 a year and the average rich person makes $100,000 a year? Or would you rather live in a society where the average poor person makes $60,000 and the rich person makes $10 million? I mean, if you're the poor person, you'd rather have $60,000 than $30,000. And that's what it should be about. It's about your standard of living. It shouldn't be about the others. Now, some, like Thomas Piketty and others, have said, well, economic growth slows down and democracy itself is threatened by income inequality. Well, both of those, I think, are fallacious. For example, there are groups now that have looked at the United States and other developed countries over the last 40 or 50 years, and they find that income inequality, if anything, is proportional to economic growth. Not inversely proportional, but actually proportional. Now, if you look at developing countries, you may get a different answer on this. But I think that we've gone so far in worrying so much about this that people don't also realize how you make people equal, which gets back to how do you make people equal again? How do you make outcomes equal? And people say, well, we'll just do a little bit. Well, it becomes very arbitrary. What is a little bit? And I think that's what a lot of our youth want. As they say, they want fairness and equality. And we try to make the point there is you can have fairness and equality, but you have to have a fairness and equality police. Someone's got to enforce it, and they've got to do something that is contrary to man's nature, and that is that we're going to try to have a perfectible, equal outcome society. One of the sources that we used that is a great website, and I highly recommend, is humanprogress.org. It's sort of like, you know, the bad news of everybody on television saying that controversy is all that happens in Washington. It's the same thing as that always in the news they're reporting statistics about how terrible the world is and how it's such a rotten place to live. And I've started beginning my speeches, particularly to kids, saying there's never, ever, ever, ever been a better time to be alive. And the statistics are overwhelming when you think about it. Think about the health statistics. In 1900, the average person lived to be 46. Now it's about 80. Think of infant mortality. It used to be, you know, a very significant infant mortality. Now it's, you know, less than 1 in 1,000 or less than 1 in 10,000. Very small. Childhood mortality used to be about 1/3 of kids died before age 5. All of that has plummeted. Look at poverty. And the poverty statistics, this is a story that humanprogress.org is really telling, and people need to learn this and understand this. In 1820, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. This is measured as less than $2 a day. It's a World Bank statistic, and they do it in constant dollars, and they move forward. So 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. When I was born in the early 1960s, it was about 1/3 of the world. So we went from 90% extreme poverty to about 1/3 of the world extreme poverty. Not the United States, the entire world. India, Bangladesh, all of Africa, all of the developing nations, everybody, when I was born, is about 1/3. Today, it's actually less than 10%. So the statistics don't lie. I mean, if you look at world GDP, it's doubled 8 times in the last 200 years. If you look at purchasing power of how much food you can buy for the same amount of average hours worked, it's amazing. And from 1919 to 2019, 100 years, what an average hourly wage can buy 7 times as much food now. Used to be 1/3 of your income for a worker was going to food. Now it's 12% clothes. Kelly always gets mad at me and I say, I bought this shirt at Target for $7. It's amazing how inexpensive clothes are. And she's like, quit telling everybody you shop at Target for your clothes, you know? But the thing is, it is pretty amazing. And I think that seeing the positive aspect of progress in the world is important, because the people who are selling you doomsday, the people who are selling you that rich people have all the money and woe is me, and that the economic pie is like this, and if you get rich, I have to get poor. It's absolutely untrue, completely. There is no truth to that. The rich are getting richer. The poor are getting richer. The middle class is being decimated because they're moving into the upper class. These are the statistics, and we can't let the other side argue things that are not true. The statistics are overwhelming.
The book does. I mean, it is the case against socialism, but it's also the case for capitalism, and you know, all of the ways that our lives have been improved by that. And so sometimes statistics like the left will use like wage stagnation or something. But as I was talking earlier about consumption and what you can actually buy for your money has changed so much. So people often look back and say, oh, the 60s or the 50s, you could buy a house and only one person had to have a job and you could pay for all these things. But the truth is, compared to the 1960s, most average workers have about twice the purchasing power. There's a statistic from that same group, Human Progress, that said that in the 1960s, the average worker, I think it's in 1960, the average worker would spend, this is an average worker, would take about 115 hours of labor to afford to buy a Sears refrigerator. That same average worker could buy that same refrigerator today for about 15 hours of labor. So it's really staggering in terms of
just
just
not from
what's
Sears.
Oh, well,
But it is true. It's absolutely true.
This is true. And you know, the other thing, back to sort of Scandinavia and the fascination that so many of our politicians have with them, it is true that in the 70s they did flirt with pretty serious socialism. Sweden, for example, was one of the 4th richest country in the world going into like by the late 60s, but they were extremely capitalist then. They had very low, similar taxes to the United States, low corporate taxes, and that's really when all of their industries were formed. I think, like, I can't remember the statistic, but it's like 25 out of their 30 largest industries were formed then. Then they elected pretty hard left government and started really expanding their social welfare state. Taxes went through the roof. But what happened? Number one, the wealthy fled. The founder of IKEA fled. Bjorn Borg fled. I mean, they were all leaving the country and taking their capital with them. And they hit a really significant recession in the 90s. And that's when they started electing center-right politicians and really enacting the politics of Reagan and Thatcher much more than socialist policies. And they've been moving that way ever since. I think it was the early 2000s that they completely dropped their wealth taxes to lure their wealthy industrialists back into the country, because they could not support their social welfare system without these folks. And again, they're still heavily taxing the middle class. But when you hear the statistics that are like, oh, well, the Swedish Americans, they live longer, they have lower infant mortality, they have less poverty than than Americans. And I would say to them, if you look at the statistics of Swedish Americans and Danish Americans, they actually have higher incomes than your average American. They actually have better health and lifestyle outcomes than the average American living in America, Swedish Americans and Danish Americans. So some of these statistics may be genetic, I don't know. I mean, but before they enacted socialism, they lived longer than we did. So a lot of those things, when the left tries to tell you that they are related to having socialized medicine, that's just not true.
This is, Friedman's story, where the Swedish economist comes up to Milton Friedman and he says, well, you know, we have no poverty in Sweden. And Friedman responds, well, you know, we have no poverty among Swedish Americans. And it's this whole thing, you know, they live longer lives. Well, they've been living longer lives since way before they even got socialized medicine in Sweden. So it's like, it's cause and effect, and people need to be a little bit more careful about it. We're going to wrap up, we're going to take a couple questions, but the bottom line is that we want the next generation to learn a little bit about the history of socialism. We want them to think about whether or not it's an accident that we got authoritarians, it's an accident that we got state violence, or whether or not it's inherent to socialism. We want them to think also about if the rights of the individual are made secondary to the needs or the desire of the collective, does that not make violence possible, but also all of the horrible things that have happened in history that we all now know were wrong and we're getting away from, the discrimination and the racism, all those things, or by treating people as groups and clumps of people that have a characteristic, so you're part of this group, as opposed to saying we're all unique individuals, uniquely either made in our Creator or uniquely precious in our own individual way that deserves to be defended, deserves to be protected from the collective. And it's an argument that I think is worth having. And Jefferson said basically that every generation had to renew and sort of re-water the liberty tree. I think that's true with knowledge, that we can't let things be forgotten about the historical examples of socialism. But we also can't let the other side get away with pointing to, no, this is the socialism I like, which really in the end isn't socialism, and it isn't working because because we tax only the rich. The only way they get to their big welfare state is by taxing the heck out of everybody. I do think it's a debate worth having, and I thank you for coming out today.